Mhm. So now it's recording. I am going to stop and you can start at any time.
All right. Hi, my name is Gilly Barrett. I'm currently an intern at Nemours AI DuPont Hospital in Wilmington, Delaware, and I'm a student at Gallaudet University. This poster today is my dissertation project that was defended in January that I'm sharing with you today, titled An Exploration of Questions as They Apply to Signing and Oral Deaf Children Participating in Parent-Child Interaction Therapy, or PCIT. So as we know, behavioral interventions are usually developed for English speakers, hearing English speakers, and there's something that's really cool about PCIT is that there's a strong emphasis on really moving towards cultural and linguistic adaptations to make this intervention as accessible as possible. But one community that is often overlooked and underserved is the deaf community, in particular the ASL users in the deaf community. And this is problematic because research has suggested that there is actually a prevalence of behavioral difficulties and language development difficulties within the deaf community. So PCIT would be a perfect intervention for that. Excuse me. So there have been a couple of studies so far looking at some potential adaptations and some case studies about how we can apply PCIT for the deaf signing community. But more research is definitely needed to see how the skills in PCIT are actually functioning differently for ASL users. So there is one study done by Dr. Day and her colleagues, who's my advisor at Gallaudet, looking at different kinds of adaptations that can be considered. And one that really stuck out to me was considering how we code when using PCIT with ASL users, because the coding system is something that we use throughout the entire intervention. So it would be really important to make sure that we've adapted it correctly. So one thing in particular that I noticed is that PCIT in general has quite the emphasis on reducing the amount of questions that we use. But in ASL, there is actually a grammatical structure that is unique to ASL that incorporates a question. But it's kind of understood that it's not supposed to have an answer. So I was wondering if there is really a difference in how these kinds of questions are functioning compared to the traditional questions that we are coding in PCIT. I also noticed that there is not much research that looks at sort of baseline PCIT skill usage before we've taught anything compared to the baseline ECB scores to see if there's any sort of relationship or predictive power for the PCIT skills that we're going to be teaching. So thus this study is exploring that PCIT skill usage. Specifically, I'm going to be breaking down questions. And we're looking only at the baseline data and the coding from the baseline DPIC session. And the goal is to better understand how these skills are functioning in ASL users. So hopefully this study, the goal is to sort of be a stepping stone in the direction of adapting PCIT for deaf ASL users. So I had 4 research questions. The first question was related to PRIDE skills or DO skills. I lumped them into one category. And I was curious to see if the PRIDE skills as they present pre-treatment, meaning before we've taught anything, are related to lower ECB intensity scores that were collected pre-treatment. The second question similarly breaks down each of the don't questions. So that's questions, commands, and criticisms, and seeing if the pre-treatment skills there are related to higher intensity scale scores on the ECB. The third one is where I broke down the questions into the categories that are actually in our manual for PCIT treatment, and that's the information questions, unintentional, and hidden command, to see if any of those categories are more strongly related to pre-treatment ECB scores compared to the others. Now, finally, the last question I had is related to the category that I was talking about before. It's those grammatical questions in ASL. So I was wondering if what I'm calling syntactic rhetorical questions in ASL are correlated with higher ECB scores pre-treatment. And I want to see if they're functioning differently than those that I examined in question 3. So for this study, I had 22 oral deaf families and 20 signing deaf families. And for all of these families, at least one of the family members was deaf, and all had completed at least the DPIC session. So the oral group was recruited from a database at the River School in Washington, D.C., and all of these families had seen Dr. Adams Costa. And this school is a school for children who are oral deaf and hearing children to be in an integrated setting. So PCIT was offered to all of the deaf students in the school, whether they had clinically significant behaviors or not. So some of these scores were subclinical, but we weren't comparing the groups to each other, so that wasn't too much of a consideration. The second group is the signing group that came from Gallaudet University at the PCIT clinic. And all of these families saw Dr. Lori Day, and they're from the DMV area. So that's anyone, oops, excuse me, sorry about that. Anyone who has clinically significant behaviors are usually the ones that are referred to this clinic, all of whom are ASL users. So for all of these participants, I had videos that were already completed at session, and the transcription was created from an undergrad student who identifies as deaf and is a native ASL user, since I myself am not a native ASL user, despite being fluent. Then I used the ECBE intensity scale only to measure what I was calling for the rest of the study, the disruptive behaviors. So that's sort of my variable that I was comparing to. And then finally, I used the DPIX-4 to look at how PCIT skills are coded and break down the questions into categories. So as I gave a little preview because I clicked by accident, here is sort of the breakdown of the question categories that I used. So you can see the top 3 categories are those DPIX categories we're used to explaining to parents. So the information questions, unintentional, and hidden commands. And then the final category is my new category, which is the syntactic rhetorical questions. So this category was only used to code ASL users' videos, because this is a structure that only exists in ASL and not in spoken English, so it was not appropriate to use for the oral group. So these questions are ones that are grammatically structured questions in ASL that look like a question, but are implied to not elicit a response. So it's distinct from a rhetorical question because this is considered to be correct grammar in ASL. And these statements don't typically end in a question, but rather are immediately followed by a statement that answers the question. So for example, that might be something like, "You're doing what?" "Building a tower." So the parent is going to answer themselves. So for these videos, I coded all of them for these question types. And then I also had a linguistics consultant working with me for reliability coding, again, because I'm not a native ASL user and I wanted to make sure that I was being true to the linguistic structure. So you can see here in these figures sort of what the breakdown of some of the skill usage looked like, where the blue is the ASL group and the red is the oral group. So if you look on the left, you can see the PRIDE skills really had a wide range for the oral group, but there was a lot more frequency of usage for the oral group overall. In fact, that was true for all of the categories, where the skill usage was just more frequent than the ASL users. So that was certainly a consideration in terms of group differences that I had to keep in mind. If you look over at the right, you can see the question types and how they break down. And you can see again that the oral group is using more of each of the categories when compared to the signing group. So knowing that there's this difference, in addition to the fact that we recognize that there are cultural and linguistic differences as well between these groups, knowing that the oral group might be subclinical, it was really important to make sure that we were looking into group differences. So the first thing that I did before analyzing anything was to run a t-test to see if there are group differences. From this test, we found a couple of things. So the first thing that we found was that there are indeed group differences that are significant. So we should be controlling for group differences rather than combining them in our analysis. The second thing we found, which was kind of an extra thing we weren't expecting, was that there was not enough frequency of commands and criticisms in the 5-minute span videos that we were looking at to code. So we had to omit those variables, leaving the PRIDE skills as one group and the questions as another. Then we went to the first portion of our analysis. So I first did a forced regression analysis to look at all of the PRIDE skills and the don't skills, but which we narrowed down to the questions, in comparison to baseline ECBE intensity scores. So if we look at the first model, that is just controlling for group differences to see how much variance can be explained. And what I found is that there really was not a significant explanation of variance just in looking at group differences. Then when I added in the other predictor variables, which was the PRIDE skills and the questions, I found that there still was no significant group variance description there either. So far for this first part of the analysis, none of the skills had necessarily any predictive power over what ECBE scores might be looking like. For the second part of the analysis, knowing that there are group differences, I wanted to run another test before looking at the question categories as they break down. So as I mentioned before, the oral group in general was using more utterances, and that was true for each of the categories of questions. So it was important to check what kinds of differences there were there. So as I ran this analysis, I found that for all three categories, they were functioning significantly differently. So I had to break them up and be conscious of controlling for group differences. So in that second regression, I saw again that group differences alone could not explain the variances happening in the data. And then when looking at the new predictors, which are each of the question types, information, unintentional, and hidden command, as we have in the DPIX-4, once again, there was no statistical significance, meaning that none of these categories, based on my population that I had and my sample that I had, were significant predictors for baseline ECB scores. The last thing I did was I looked at my new category of syntactic rhetorical questions. Now remember, this was only for the ASL group, so the power was a little bit reduced because we had a smaller group for this. And we ran a correlation to see how the ECB intensity scores correlate with the use of syntactic rhetorical questions. Once again, we found that there was no significance, meaning that there was no predicted power over these ECB scores. So when thinking about this, there are a lot of sort of concepts that popped out. So the first is, as we discussed a little earlier, the group differences were due to several reasons, including culture, language, mean utterances, referral question, clinical scores. There was a lot of group differences that needed to be considered. The second thing we noticed is that when actually doing the coding, since I did the coding separately from the linguistics consultant, we found that there were a couple of discrepancies, but we were able to recognize why these discrepancies were happening. And it was always because of either the fact that the consultant coded more than I did, knowing that I am more experienced in coding PCIT language than she is, that we weren't sure whether gestures should be coded, knowing that ASL is a very visual and gestural language, but there are some gestures that are not considered actual signs. And finally, the fact that there is a lot of overlap in the categories. So before reporting any of this data, the linguistic consultant and I sat together and made sure that we were agreeing with all of the coding that we came up with. So when thinking about the first and second research question, that was what was being looked at for the first forced regression that showed no significance. And what that means is that for now, we know that the baseline parent skill usage alone cannot predict baseline behaviors. We also know from research question 3, which was the second forced regression, that any of the pre-existing question categories that we have in PCIT are not necessarily predictive of baseline behaviors when looked at in isolation. The final question was related to the correlation between ECB scores and the new category of syntactic rhetorical questions, was also not significant, which might have been due to a couple of reasons, the first of which was probably because the frequency was quite low, not only because of the reduction in the sample size, but also because this was the least frequently used type of question for these groups. So many limitations to consider for this study. The first, again, is that the sample was small. For future research, doing something like this might be more powerful to see with larger sample sizes. Just like I said earlier, by controlling for group, this had to reduce the power just a little bit, but it would have been inappropriate to combine these groups knowing that there are significant group differences. The next limitation was that I only looked at the first 5 minutes of the DPIX coding. It's possible that looking at longer coding sections might have yielded more skill usage in the categories so that we could see a more rich amount of data, and maybe we could have included as well the criticisms and commands with more frequency. The next consideration is that all of the oral participants are from one school, and it's a very specific environment that's created for oral deaf children. And this might not be representative of the oral deaf majority, knowing that many oral deaf children are in mainstream schools or are in deaf-specific programs. Also with the oral group, because this was offered to all of them, many of them had subclinical scores. So it's possible that if all of the participants had clinical scores, we might have seen something different, both in the parent skill usage and in some of the results that we had. Next is that we only use baseline data. So what we know about PCIT is that we're looking at the change of skill usage over time. And that is why we have the ECB as a measure, to sort of see the changes that we're looking for over time until we get to graduation. It's possible that we would see very different results if we did look over time and not just at baseline data. So that is an important consideration for future research. The next is that even though when we are teaching about not using questions in our CDI teach, we don't necessarily break out the categories when we are doing our coding in all of our subsequent sessions. So when we are coding, it's one questions category rather than saying information, unintentional, and hitting command. So this is something that broke down the frequency even more and might have reduced the power as well. The final thought here is that something that's very important to recognize is that we use the ECB intensity scale as a holistic number. So it's possible that if we did an item analysis, in other words, looking at the specific behaviors that are asked about on the ECB, we may have seen something very different and seen that maybe some question types or the pride skills are predictive of certain behavior disruptions and not others. So it's important to really look at the specific behaviors to learn more about this. So what we know from the study is that there's still a lot to learn, but it's important to consider that some of these things might be functioning differently when we're thinking about those syntactic rhetorical questions. But for now, all we know is that we can't look at parent skill usage alone to be predicting the ECB scores. Many people that I cited here, many of whom are probably here at this convention virtually. And then this is sort of the final poster itself. All right, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for that. That is fantastic. As someone who was a research assistant in a lab looking at language acquisition and development in a population that is using Nicaraguan Sign Language, which is like a newly emerging language, and also kind of making comparisons with ASL and all of that. This is really fantastic to see how you're integrating PCIT into that population. I think the gesture consideration is huge, and I'm really interested in seeing where that goes and how PCIT decides to take a look at that and see just kind of how coding and all of that accommodates for the way that gesture is used in ASL, which, as you noted, is different than how it might be for a speaking population. I do have to get to the other presentation, but I would love if you could clarify the difference in the two groups, the oral deaf and the signing population, just kind of why use that group distinction.
Yeah, so the important thing to recognize here is that I didn't want to be comparing groups to each other, but I did want to have a sort of comparison group to be able to see those differences. So the oral deaf group is using spoken English, which is what PCIT was developed for in the first place, was that spoken English. But I wanted to include that deaf culture component. So having the oral deaf group was sort of a good comparison for us to have, knowing that it's the language that PCIT was developed for, but not necessarily the culture.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And looking forward to seeing you at the conference. I'm going to pop